Welcome to week 5, Plenty and Privation. So, we're going to be talking today about food. Most of the time, we're going to be talking about food shortages, but we'll also be talking about food surpluses as well. And we're going to go all the way from earliest recorded civilization and even before up to the present era. So, we're really going to be covering quite a bit of history when it comes to this particular topic. So first, I want to talk about ancient floods, famines, and droughts. Certainly, throughout the Near East, what we would today call the Middle East, Persia, what we would today call Iran, modern-day Turkey. A lot of these areas, even before the Jewish presence was really pronounced in the Eastern Mediterranean, there's a lot of flood narratives, and that has been a source of continual speculation when it comes to archaeologists who study this type of thing. Now, I'm not commenting in what I say next on the veracity of the biblical flood. I'm just saying that there are a lot of different versions of the flood, which has led people to believe that there might really have been an event that took place. And the current theory, well, actually, there's two theories, but one of the theories that has some evidence going for it, although there's evidence going the other direction as well, is something called the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis. The Black Sea being lower than the Mediterranean and right now connected through the Bosporus Strait. But the Bosporus Strait wasn't always connected to those two bodies of water weren't always connected. And the theory was that the Black Sea was a very low, very small lake, quite a bit lower in elevation. And that, due to an earthquake or something similar, there was a break in the mountain, in the hills, in between the Mediterranean and this very low-lying lake. And, either all at once or more than likely over a period of time, water slowly but surely came into this very low-lying area of the Near East. And all the people that lived there were forced to kind of move out in different directions because the waters were rising. And you see interesting linguistic elements to language that seem to, from different areas and technologies that seem to have kind of evolved from a singular source, probably a civilization that lived in this area. That's the theory, at least, that there really was a sort of a deluge that resulted in a lot of these primitive cultures having stories about this event that then over time kind of become tweaked a little bit, mythologized, and kind of go in separate directions. One being the Epic of Gilgamesh, another being the biblical flood narrative of the Hebrews, that type of thing. So certainly there is evidence of ancient floods in civilized areas that were very, very problematic. There were also droughts as well. A lack of water, usually when it wouldn't rain for a while. In fact, we see this with the story of Joseph. If you recall the biblical story of Joseph, where the Pharaoh, this is in Egypt, has two dreams. 7 fat cows getting devoured by 7 skinny cows is one of the dreams, and then ears of corn. Well, certainly, again, archaeologists cannot prove the story of Joseph, but they certainly can prove the existence of these kind of pulses of fat ears and lean ears with a lot of water, a lot of rain, crops grow very, very well, everyone's happy, everyone's full, and you have surplus. And then you have periods of time where it's just not raining, and as a consequence, crops aren't growing very well. And certainly the Egyptians, as the first true civilization on Earth, many people believe, came up with this concept of, okay, in years of plenty, we need to put some of it away so that when we have years of privation, we won't starve to death. We'll be able to survive on our surplus. And that's kind of what the story of Joseph is at that particular point of Joseph's life. That's how he comes to have a place of favor in Pharaoh's court. Droughts are in evidence in a lot of different areas. Certainly the Mayans were crippled by drought even before the Spanish arrived. It made it easier for the Spanish to take over in Central America because the Mayan civilization had already been in decline because of decade after decade of drought, punctuated by short periods of some wet years. But even in places where it rains quite a bit, such as in Central America in the jungles, if it doesn't rain as much, there's a certain level of rain that's expected, that's needed for certain cultivation. And when it doesn't happen, the food source is impacted. Mesa Verde, for those of you that have ever been to southwestern Colorado near Four Corners, Mesa Verde was a flourishing civilization of the Amerindians, and they built the cliff dwellings, which are quite astonishing. But it was something like a 50-year drought, and they just all left. People starved to death, and those that didn't decided to move on and try to find places where the rain was a little bit more reliable. It destroyed that civilization. Angkor Wat, the ruins in Cambodia, one of the most amazing places in the world. I've never been there, but my parents have. My parents have been everywhere, and they're not easily impressed anymore, but they were quite impressed with Angkor Wat. You can Google pictures of Angkor Wat. It's this huge area with all these temples and people living there, and they essentially abandoned it because of climate change, because of drought. And then finally, Easter Island. Easter Island, it's hard to know exactly why things... There's different theories as to why Easter Island now doesn't have a single tree, essentially, on it. It's almost completely devoid of trees, whereas it was heavily forested, 400 years ago. But one theory is a lot of the trees were dying because of drought. Another theory is they cut down the trees to roll. Easter Island's where they have the giant stone figures that kind of stand like sentries throughout the landscape. And, people have always wondered, how do they get the stones that, weigh 40, 50 tons from the quarries out to where they are on the plain? Well, what they almost certainly did was they had logs, and they laid them on logs and pulled them along on logs, almost acting as wheels. But certainly that wouldn't account for why that would have accounted for a lot of logs and trees chopped down, but it wouldn't account for the entire deforestation of the island. It almost certainly had something to do with drought. Of course, drought leads to famine. Famine, we'll be talking a little bit about famine a little bit later in this lecture, but famine is when there's not enough food supply and people are starving to death. They're dying from starvation, they're dying from malnutrition, which leads to disease, and we've unfortunately seen quite a bit of that in human history and even in the history of the 20th century. Now, are these always bad? Well, yes, famine is always bad. Okay, I think we can say that. Drought's usually bad too. There's really not a lot of redeeming aspects about drought. Yes, maybe because of the drought, there'll be a new innovation that's been discovered, but really there's no kind of redeeming value to drought. You cannot say the same, however, for floods. The major civilizations of the ancient world grew up along rivers. The Nile in Egypt, northern Africa, the Tigris and Euphrates, forming what's called the Fertile Crescent, and what we would today call Iraq. At that time, it was Babylon, Persia. The Indus River in India, the Yellow River in China, and I think there's one more that's escaping my memory at this point. But what made these rivers so good for agriculture is that they had a lot of silt in their the riverbed. Now, silt is very, very good for growing crops. It's very nutrient rich. Now, what you could do is you could, uh, dredge up silt and take it into the field and spread it. But number one, the technologies for doing that did not exist in the ancient world. And number two, you didn't have to, because in some of these cases it was once every third year. In other cases, it was more like once every 5 or 6 years. The river would flood. The river would flood and it would carry a lot of that silt out into the surrounding plains and would take it out into the fields. And then the next year they'd plant crops there, and for the next couple of years the crops would just grow like crazy because they had this nutrient-rich soil, the silt. And so the floods actually were part of the lifeblood of these early civilizations. Now you didn't want too big a flood. You didn't want a flood that lasted a couple of years. You didn't want a flood that killed people or drove everyone away. But there was this kind of flooding that happened on a semi-regular basis that they counted on in order to replenish the nutrients in the soil. So that's just kind of an interesting aspect about this topic. There are unfortunately a lot of examples of modern floods, famines, and droughts. I don't know if you've seen some of the footage of Australia, but you should have for this week because I assigned it. The drought leading to terrible, terrible fires that in some cases are, like 1 million acres are up in flame. And then, just like a few weeks later, you can have torrential downpours. Australia is sort of the land of extremes when it comes to their wet season and their dry season. Their dry season, it's hot and dry and everything burns. And their wet season, it rains like crazy, which creates lots and lots of foliage that serves as fuel for when we're back to the dry season where it dries up and a lightning strike or somebody throws away a cigarette, a spark from a power line, and you have a gigantic fire on your hands. I saw a huge fire when I was lucky enough to be traveling around Australia. I was unlucky enough to see a fire which was just consuming huge amounts of the outback and no doubt killing a lot of the animals that live there. We're currently in a drought in California right now. It kind of broke last year. Last year was a very wet year. Is it permanent? Is the drought permanently gone? They say probably not. This year's been kind of wet too so far, this winter at least. We'll have to see, but California has been in a very long-term drought that's been very problematic towards the future of the state. If you drive up the 5 or the 99 between here and Northern California, you've seen all the wasted orchards that just sit there barren and dry and desiccated and dead, and the billboards and the sides of the trucks of the semi-trailers that farmers have painted messages on, decrying the political decisions that are being made in Sacramento, the livelihood of a lot of farmers at stake. One, if you can find this, I didn't include this picture in your reading because it's just a photograph, but Google something like California Central Valley loss of elevation or something like that. If you look hard enough, you can find it's a telephone pole with a guy standing next to it, and it has how high the land was, like in 1925, 1945, 1975 in the present. And it's something like 40 feet that the land is, maybe it's more like 35 feet probably, that the land has dropped because of all the water that's been pumped out of the ground. Because if we're not getting the water from the sky, if we're not getting natural water that creates rain, that creates runoff, that gets used for irrigation, we have to find the water somewhere else, and we're going to take it out of the ground. Well, the problem with groundwater is once you take it out, you can't put it back in easily. And it's not like it just sits there and waits for the rain to get. Once it gets pumped out, the land is so heavy that it collapses in on itself. And they can measure this, incidentally. Ever since 1975, they've been able to measure this with satellites. And the California Central Valley has collapsed in on itself. And because of all the water that's been taken out of the ground in order to make up for the lack of water coming from the sky, it's a real problem moving forward. Another modern famine and a drought, they're often linked together, is in the Sudan. It's amazing how it doesn't really make, there's one in Ethiopia right now. The last couple of years, it hasn't been making the news. It's almost like we have a limited capacity for paying attention to a certain type of tragedy when it comes to this type of thing. When it comes to war, we want to watch the fire. The fire, if it bleeds, it leads in news shows. But somehow, famine is kind of a slow creeping death that kind of isn't as sensational as watching footage from a war or a fire or something of that nature. And so droughts today are often kind of out of sight, out of mind. The final one I put in there is the French Revolution. Usually it's droughts leading to famine. Sometimes it's warfare. This one was very interesting. It was a volcano. Actually led to the French Revolution. The volcano in question was in Iceland and erupted in 1783, and it was a fairly decent sized eruption. It wasn't the biggest ever, but it erupted a number of times, sort of towards the end of 1783 and into 1784. So it's over a matter of months, and it ended up injecting, because it was erupting right along rather than just one big eruption. It put a lot of ash into the air. Now, what this ends up doing is, and this has happened before, this has happened with Krakatoa, with Tambora, even as recently as the 1980s with Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. But a big enough eruption puts enough ash into the air that it actually, over the course of time, can lower the temperature of the earth by blocking a little some of the UV and the sunlight that tries to get through. And this happened, like I said, it finished erupting in 1784, and it took a few years, but the crops started failing, and they failed for a couple of years, which France was particularly hard hit. France was, people were starving in France, people were angry, and they responded by starting this revolution, capturing the monarchy and executing them. And so the French Revolution, it was a sort of a distant cause. It wasn't an immediate cause, but a distant cause was the eruption of a volcano, which led to lower crop yields for several years, which eventually led to angry citizens overthrowing their country and abolishing the monarchy. Of course, they'd bring it back, a few years later after Napoleon, but it was never the same after that. There are aspects of policy which don't necessarily lead to famine, but make it a lot worse. Certainly, the most pronounced example of this in the 20th century, and certainly one of the worst of all time, maybe not the worst ever, but certainly one of the worst ever, was China's Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward was Mao Zedong's attempt in China, going from about 1958 to 1962, to radically change the face of China economically, politically, and socially. It was an attempt to move from an agricultural society to an industrial society. And what they did was they abolished private property. Well, private property was already abolished, but they really abolished it. Everyone had to leave their homes and move to communes. And they had to inspect what you were taking with you and whether or not it was necessary. And then they went through your house and they took everything they wanted, the government. They were particularly looking for metal, so that they could make bullets and other materials that they could use in the war effort, or in the Great Leap Forward effort, and in the wars that would soon be fought with India in the Indo-Sino War, and that they were anticipating fighting with Taiwan. Um, it was an absolute unmitigated disaster. First of all, a lot of they weren't able to scale correctly. You can't just create a bunch of factories from nothing and have people that don't know how to work the machines. And the population was a worker force geared towards agriculture. And what they were learning at these communes is they were being drilled in communist ideology and policy. The majority of the time, and very, very little being given the skills that would become very, very necessary to have these factories be productive. So that was a little bit of a disaster. And then the theory is that we don't need nearly as many farmers to produce food. There's a lot of food waste, and if we bring everyone together in these communes, we'll be able to control the access of food, and we'll be able to be a lot more efficient. Well, turns out it was inefficient. Furthermore, just everything failed on almost every single dimension. Mao Zedong had this idea that one reason, as so often happens in dictatorships, when something goes wrong, nobody can tell the guy in charge because they're afraid. That's a real problem with autocratic societies, is that everyone's terrified to point out, hey, this is a problem and here's a solution. Because by doing that, de facto, you're criticizing the dictator. So when the crop yields were starting to fail because there weren't enough people to, pick the produce, one theory that Mao Zedong had, which turned out not to be true, was that we see all these birds that are hanging around in the fields. They must be eating the wheat and the rice, and they must be eating the seeds that we try to plant in the ground. So what he did was that every day, probably after breakfast, all the young kids would go out with all these rocks that they had collected, and then they would follow birds around, just throwing rocks at them, hoping to hit them and kill them, but with the theory that if we don't allow them to stop moving, if we don't allow them to eat, then they will die. And he was 100% correct. Birds have a very high metabolism and need to be eating right along. They can't just kind of take a day off from eating, or else they will die. Well, it turns out that a lot of the birds that they were killing were insectivores. The birds were hanging out in the fields because they were eating the insects that were trying to eat the plants. So once they killed all the birds off, the insects just took over and decimated the crops, which already were, not being very efficient to begin with. It was just an absolute disaster. No one knows exactly how many people died, but usually the number that you see is 45 million people died in this famine. Well, you're talking about as many people, and maybe up to 55. That's the highest number I've ever seen. Well, the highest number you're going to find for World War II is 60 million. A lot of those being Russian and Chinese civilians. So you're talking about something that's on par with World War II, okay? And it was just this horrible, horrible experience that was an utter failure and was a real problem for China moving forward. Of course, China's now risen to be essentially the world's dominant economy, set to take out over the United States at any point, probably will do so in the wake of the coronavirus. But it's just an example of how policy can maybe not cause famine, but certainly exacerbate it and make it that much worse. And that was the Great Leap Forward, which of course has this ironic name that now lives on in history. Uh, the Great Irish Famine, or sometimes called the Great Irish Potato Famine, was another one of these ones where policy. At first, the British government did an okay job at sort of managing it, but they became increasingly unwilling to commit resources. They became convinced that what they were doing was working initially, so they didn't need to kind of, in a crisis, you have to be nimble because the face of a crisis can often change very, very quickly. And the British just weren't very good at that. Oh yeah, our policy's working. We're good. We don't have to revisit this for the next year. Well, by the time they figured out that that wasn't the case, like a million, I think it's essentially like something like 1 million Irish Irish starved to death, and another 1.3 left the country. So essentially, 25% of the Irish in just like a 2 or 3 year period were either dead or living in the United States now. And the British were very, very complicit in this. And one reason why the Irish still don't like the British very much goes all the way back to this. There were other potato famines. In fact, I think it's an earlier one where a man by the name of Jonathan Swift writes this satirical essay called A Modest Proposal, where he proposes that, hey, there's too many Irish for the amount of food that we have, and there's not enough food for the Irish. So how do let's have the Irish eat their own babies. Okay, that, number one, reduces the amount of Irish so that there's closer to being parity between resources and mouths, and it provides a food source. It's a win-win situation. Now, Jonathan Swift was Irish, so you can understand he wasn't advocating this seriously. What he was doing was criticizing the British for not acting. And when it comes to babies, incidentally, I mentioned the 45 million, 50 million essentially. Some people think as many as 55 for the Great Leap Forward. As many babies were aborted or died in the womb because of malnutrition as died. So, it was 45 to 50 million deaths, and then it was 45 to 50 million abortions, whether it was voluntary because there was no food or because the body reacting to the lack of nutrition. So, these modern famines are almost a biblical proportion. Some of them are just as bad as any in history, particularly the Great Leap Forward. The role of the media is important. I remember very vividly. I was born in 1973, so this is when I was 10 to 12 years old. The Great Ethiopian Famine. I wasn't. This is not when I lost my innocence about the world and its problems, but this was kind of a new level for me and a lot of people my age, because it was one of the first times that you saw this type of thing on television. Famines had been around during the era of television since the 1950s, since really television became commonplace. But there was this kind of hold back from showing it. It wasn't proper to show. It was too grotesque. Well, at some point, I don't know if it was people wanting a story or people wanting to do right by the world and do right by the Ethiopians, that to actually show, hey, this is what is happening in a world where we do have enough food to feed everyone. Look what's happening to people. But whether it was out of a sense of trying to get a good story, or whether it was out of a sense of wanting to do the right thing, it sort of doesn't matter. What the news stories did was they put a face on famine. They put a face on something that, for the United States and Europe and the developed world, it's not our problem. It's not something that, it's, a bunch of people are dying and it's horrible, but, I don't want to, I have other things to worry about and think about. Well, all of a sudden, in 1983, you started seeing, literally, I remember it was like for a better part of a year, you just turn on the TV and there's news, you pick up the newspaper, and for whatever reason, this was a turning point where the media said, no, we're going to show this stuff. And it really was, I think, a powerful thing for a lot of Europeans and Americans to actually have to see this thing and witness and look at a child who's clearly starving to death, and hear about how both parents of that child starved to death, saving all their food for their child, who's now within a week or two of starvation. And this is when the whole sponsorship, you can sponsor a child for $1 a day, type thing started. And you'd be surprised how quickly some people got jaded to it. You started seeing a lot of jokes. I remember there was this kid. He turned out to be a really nice guy, by the way, but I won't say his name just in case you know him in the community. But he's now a nurse, and just kind of a really sweet, nice guy. But he came to school one time and said, "What's this?" And your kids, your skin stretchier, and he pulled out his skin, and we said, "I don't know," and he said, "It's a piece of rice stuck in an Ethiopian's throat." Okay, and people laughed, and I thought to myself, I don't think that's very funny, but they're just. It seemed to polarize people into almost two different camps. There were the people that got jaded to it very, very quickly. They made fun of Sally Struthers. I think her name was Sally Struthers. She's the one that would kind of do these commercials about feeding people for $1 a day. And yeah, it was. I'll admit the commercials did lend themselves to ridicule because she would put on this very sad voice, and they would have this kind of very mournful violin music. I mean, it was way over the top. It shouldn't have been that over the top. But you're laughing about people starving to death. You're making fun of. She was a singer and an actress who essentially ruined her career because acting and singing was getting in the way of trying to help people in Africa, in South America, and in other places. Google her, Sally Struthers. I mean, if I'm getting the name correct. And people just lambasted her for this, when really, she was doing something about it. So, there were the people that kind of became jaded to it. They felt sorry for about 6 months and then stop with this whole Ethiopia thing. But I do think that there were a lot of people of conscience who you started seeing the rise of NGOs. There was an uptick in NGOs and people going into, the Peace Corps had been sort of a thing of the 60s and kind of petered out a little bit. And, I think that was, you can trace the modern resurgence of the Peace Corps to not just this issue, but the fact that the media was starting to report things more globally. Of course, we've talked about the fact that some famines go unnoticed. I mean, there's food insecurity in inner cities, in urban poverty in America, that's among the homeless in particular, that's bordering on famines, where people go through garbage every night in order to survive, that we just never hear stories about or think about. Immigration is always an aspect of this, and I'm using immigration in two different ways on this slide. As I already mentioned, immigration was a big thing from Ireland during the Great Irish Famine in the 19th century, but it's also been from other areas as well. We saw a lot of immigration in Latin America in the 1960s and 70s, and even after that, not always linked specifically to famine, but often linked to poverty. And so maybe not like starvation, but food insecurity. Now, the one that I'm doing a little bit differently, though, there have been some people that have left Venezuela, sort of illegally entering Colombia and other countries. But what's been very interesting is Chavez kind of created this sort of proto-socialist government that really wasn't as socialist as he would have liked to have thought, but did have share some features with socialism. Whenever people have food insecurity, they migrate away from political ideology. Whenever the economy takes a turn for the worse, it doesn't matter who's to blame. Whoever's in charge gets blamed. That's one reason I think that Trump is probably not going to get reelected. I could be wrong on that, but I think because the economy is tanking, people aren't going to assign blame. It's just that whoever's in charge kind of gets the credit, and you're seeing a lot of loss of faith in some Venezuelan institutions, people immigrating to other ideologies, you might say. That's not immigration. Maybe it's more migration, I guess. But the food insecurity on a level to the point where it gets to be starvation leads some people to physically leave, and it leads some people to mentally leave. I guess is the point that I'm trying to make. And we're certainly seeing that in Venezuela, and part of it's the sanctions that the United States is putting on the Venezuelan government. And I have to say that I'm really conflicted on this. I'll now step out of my teacher's role and just talk as Andrew Howe, giving an opinion. This is one of those tough ones because I can understand why Western democracies are putting restrictions and sanctions on Venezuela, because the government's corrupt and is subverting democracy. Yet at the same time, ultimately, who's it harming? And I think we've seen that whole thing with the Cuban, putting the sanctioning on Castro when Fidel Castro was still alive over, like a 40-year period. I can understand why the U.S. did that. But in the end of the day, Castro was not the one facing food insecurity. So these sanctions that result in food insecurity and food shortages, are very, very difficult because they're bad dudes that we're doing this to, but it rolls downhill and often affects not the bad dude, but the citizens of the country. Another element of privation that is so fascinating, I've tried them all on this list, believe it or not, is what we call starvation foods. Some of which now are not starvation foods. Some of which are sort of almost high cuisine, or at least very trendy cuisine. But everything that appears on this list was something that probably, or in some cases, has been historically demonstrated for sure, because the evolution of this food stuff is recent enough in history that we know it was a starvation food. But if you ever stop to think about Thanksgiving, we're eating yams, cranberries, and by the way, the cranberries that they ate, in the 1600s, that the Pilgrims ate in the 1600s, were not as engineered to be as sweet as they are now. And there's not sugar added to them. Okay, when you buy cranberries, and there's often, and certainly if you buy cranberry juice, there's sugar added to it. Squash, these are not necessarily things that you would necessarily think to eat unless there wasn't a lot of other options. So our Thanksgiving foods. You read about barbecue for this week. Barbecue is kind of an interesting plenty and privation. It's now a food of plenty. You do you don't barbecue by yourself. Well, maybe you can. I guess I've done it before with my little grill out in the backyard. But usually it's a social thing. You get everyone together, and you've bought 5 pounds of carne asada and invited 10 friends over or whatever. It's become a thing that you do socially. Meat's not necessarily cheap, so you splurge a little bit. Do I want to get London broil steak? For those of you that are vegetarian like I used to be and wish I still was, you can still barbecue too. But it's means something very, very different than it did before. If you look at soul food from the South, collard greens, fried okra. Okra is, I took my dad up on a challenge once and tried to eat raw okra, and it's not very good, and it's very slimy. It almost feels like you're, sometimes when you go like this and you get something from your nose back into your throat, like mucus. And I mean, okra is disgusting in one sense. Well, they discovered that if you fry it up and, use it with a sauce or something, it wasn't that bad. And then, of course, quintessentially chitlins, which are intestines. We see this in menudo as well. Certainly, intestines are something that is felt by food historians to certainly be from a culture and a time period where you didn't throw away any part of the cow or the pig or whatever. Same thing with chicken's feet in some Asian cultures. You don't throw anything away that you could potentially use, because that might, you don't take food security for granted. You're probably fine now. You probably could throw away the chicken's feet. But if you're living in a culture where there's drought or flood or an occasional famine, you learn how to use everything from the animal. Certain vegetables too. Cabbage. Who eats cabbage in their right mind? Well, cabbage is very tough and hard to eat. But they if you pickle it, if you cut it very, very fine, if you soak it in brine, if you do stuff like that, it's edible. Same thing with rhubarb. Kimchi is felt like it was probably, you didn't want to throw away cabbage even when it was spoiling. So you discovered a way to sort of pickle the cabbage in this tremendous hot sauce, tremendously hot seasoning, so that it wouldn't spoil any further, number one. And number two, you couldn't taste what was spoiling in the first place. Pho, which incidentally should be pronounced pho, as in PHA with a rising, pho, is now like a trendy, cuisine that a lot of people eat. And the pho, I'll use the Americanized version of its name, pho, was interesting in that the pho that we eat is more from the southern part of Vietnam, which was always wealthier. The pho in northern Vietnam, historically, after the French came, was that when the French would eat beef, they'd throw away the bones, or they leave the bones in the kitchen, and the Vietnamese cooks would say, well, hey, we're not going to throw this perfectly good bone away. It still has a little bit of meat on it and stuff. So they would soak it, they would boil it, simmer, I should say, rather than, low boil simmer. They would simmer these bones in water, for like 24-hour period. And this would create this, beef stock that would, they would then maybe throw a few herbs or vegetables if they could find them. They certainly wouldn't put meat in there because they didn't have any meat. They couldn't afford it. And they didn't tend to, in the north at least, put noodles because, again, they had a harder time getting their hands on it. And this kind of works its way down into the south by the late 1800s. And incidentally, if you look up the Encyclopedia of Asian American culture, is that the name of it? I wrote both the entries on pho and kimchi, which is how I know the history of those two. It made its way to the South, and they had a little bit more economic stability in the South. It was the breadbasket. There was a river up north and some agriculture, but the primary rice areas and a lot of the agriculture was down in the South. And so they were able to make rice noodles, and probably still didn't. Most pho at that point didn't have meat in it, chunks of meat. It was boiled from beef bones, but they would put foliage in there, peppers, a few other things, like we put into pho today, and maybe a little bit of noodles. Okay, so pho was a starvation food that now has kind of morphed into something completely different. And then we get to surstrumming, which is the worst food experience of my life thus far. I've never eaten durian. In fact, we were going to all eat durian together in this class. I was going to take us out onto the lawn where we could cut it up and all have a piece. Surströmming is basically the following: you take herring, you cut it up, you put it in brine, and then most people today just stick it in their fridge. But in the old days, you buried it in the ground for a year, okay, and it rots, okay, and it's under so much pressure by the time you dig it up that the can bulges up, and because it bulges up when you open it, it squirts, and it is the most foul, disgusting stuff that you'll ever smell in your entire life. That most people, they do it one of two ways. The most common way is because it's kind of become this thing that you actually have an old pair of clothes that is your surströmming clothes, so that you take your surströmming outdoors. This is what we did when I was visiting Sweden when they did this. My friends did this. And you wear this old pair of clothes that you don't mind smelling like rotten fish, and you open it, so if it splashes on your clothes, it's not clothes that you need to worry about. Or the other way you can do it is you can draw a basin of water and put a stopper at the bottom, hold the can under the water, and open it under the water. That's another way to do it. You're starting to. It's so bad. I mean, number one, I think, like, my mom doesn't have a sense of smell. She's a vegetarian, so it's a bad analogy. But I think if you didn't have a sense of smell, it would be a lot easier to eat, because it's like you're defeated as soon as you open the can. I mean, you're like retching as soon as you open the can. So, then try to eat a piece of it. But we made little burritos. We put it in tortilla. It's not easy to find tortillas necessarily in Sweden, but my friend, in anticipation of my visit, had gotten some tortillas, and she had some fresa cream, something, I can't remember what else we put into it, and I took a bite of it, and getting that thing down was, I got to be honest, it was actually, once it got in your mouth, you're smelling it less, and it wasn't as bad, but it was still not easy to choke down. I took one bite, I swallowed it, kind of almost gagged, and then threw the rest of it in the trash. So that's kind of the most. I think I put a surströmming challenge from YouTube on your to watch list. It's quite entertaining to watch people try to choke down some of that. So we've been talking about food insecurity all along, but just some things about food insecurity itself. Number one, currently there is enough food in the world to feed everybody, but it's a real problem to get it to the places that it needs to be, and also circumvent policies that need to, like right now, we have very aggressive, spoiling end dates and stuff like that. You can usually drink milk for a few days beyond, eggs you can usually go for a little bit. But there's certain things, like a thing of spaghetti sauce, is usually good for quite a while beyond when it's stamped on. We're very, very conservative in the United States, and that's good in one sense. I mean, they do that to look after our health. But the flip side of that is what happens when you're dealing with food insecurity. Should we really be throwing away this stuff when people are starving to death, when there are homeless people in Los Angeles that are going to go through the trash can anyways and find this stuff? But see, we're so litigious. We're such a litigation culture that some restaurants have learned not to throw it away in their backyard or in their trash can, where people can get access to it, or they put up this, big thing around their trash bin, because they're utterly terrified of being sued. What happens if they give this food away and somebody gets sick and they get sued, and that type of thing. So it's complicated. There's competing rules and regulations and concerns. Personally, I think that starving to death should be the major concern, and that we should worry about other things second. But you can understand why a company might want to do the right thing, but just decide that there's really nothing that we can do. I mean, I think eventually what will happen is, they'll discover ways of making food cubes, protein cubes, that will send all the old food will get sent into a single place where they will make Soylent Blue or whatever, cubes of food that's made out of old food but kind of sanitized so that it's acceptable or whatever. But right now it's not as simple and as straightforward as you might think. There's policy issues. There's distribution problems. We've heard that with the coronavirus, there's not enough truck drivers to get the product to markets. And so what a lot of these food growers are doing, let's say the people growing vegetables, is they're letting their vegetables kind of, they're throwing them into a big pile, letting them rot a little bit, churning them up, and burying them back into the soil so they can be used as fertilizer. Or doing something, mulch piles and stuff like that. So it's a complex problem. It's not that societies don't want to solve the worldwide food problem. It's that they don't want to hard enough to circumnavigate. There's other things that we're currently thinking about. The United States is worried about its own problems first, the problems of Ethiopia second. Same thing with Sweden. Same thing with France. Same thing with Australia. So it's not from a wanton disregard, but it's a very complex thing to know how to handle when it comes to distribution, the economics of distribution and policy. And it seems like there's always other things that kind of bump worldwide food shortages to the back. We've talked about food stamps before. It is about sort of greater awareness. I think most of us, probably some people in this class have dealt with food insecurity before, I'm sure. And, that's very, very unfortunate. We're all kind of now getting to see what that looks like. Although for most of us, it's just a momentary, will they have this when I go to the store? Most of us won't ever know what day after day after day after day food insecurity. And for those of you that have, I hope you're in a better position. But food insecurity is one of the most insidious things because it affects your outlook. It affects it affects the amount of focus that you're able to bring to bear on your education. If you're really worrying about this, it becomes that much harder to really focus and do a good job at work, at school, etc. Cannibalism has been demonstrated. They can take a look at brains and see what's in brains. I think it's the prions in brains that they can tell that you can tell by doing DNA sequencing of people today that their culture, if you go back far enough, was cannibalistic. Another way is that archaeologists, when they find bones, they know exactly what cuts look like when they're cutting and skinning and eating animals. Most cultures, ancient cultures that have been discovered archaeologically, human bones show some of those, particularly in times of drought. They'll find bones that they know are from a particular time period, and they show these cuts, and it just so happens to be during a time of drought. And then they find bones that don't have these cuts, and they're from times of plenty. So cannibalism is something that's been in most ancient cultures. There are some sort of infamous examples. One was the Donner Party, a group of people trying to, sort of settlers, trying to get across into California, trying to get to Sacramento. One of the leaders of the party was taking people off and killing them. Oh, he died last night, and oh, should we eat them? Yeah, let's eat them. Well, it turns out he was helping them along. That was very controversial. During the Battle of Leningrad in World War II, the Russians had to have an anti-cannibal team of people that would roam around the city collecting dead people before people would run out and hack off a limb and carry it back to their house. Thousands and thousands of people starved to death in Leningrad. And Leningrad was under siege for something like 800 days. And, if you read about it, first they ate their food, then they ate their horses, then they ate their dogs and cats, then they ate the rats. And when that ran out, they started, some people opportunistically started looking for dead bodies on the people that had just fallen down dead on the street from starvation. One that's very disquieting to us, although, I think we shouldn't necessarily judge who knows why this or how this cultural practice got started. It essentially died out by 1980. So, it's more something that was studied in the 50s and 60s and was already kind of dying out by the 70s. But there's a tribe in New Guinea that does not believe that men are born with sperm, with semen. And, if you think about it, in one sense, little boys before a certain period of time don't appear to have that capability. So therefore, they must not be born with it. So there's a ritual that actually takes place over sometimes years where the younger boys, sort of like age 8, 9, and 10, fellate the older boys and swallow their semen. And their belief then is that, once they have accumulated enough semen through this process, they will be able to. They're then at the age of at a certain age, they get married off and they're able to produce offspring. And this culture literally felt like as if we don't do this, we're going to become extinct as a culture. Now, obviously we understand science a little bit different. Our understanding of puberty and things of that nature is a little bit more scientific. But it begs the question: what is cannibalism? Because I'm going to throw one more example on here. We tend to think of cannibalism as eating human flesh. Well, one reason why the Romans were so punished Christians so much, were persecuting Christians like crazy, was that they viewed that the Christians were cannibals. And to the Romans, that was just absolutely disgusting. And you say, well, why would they think that? Well, that's what communion says. That's what the preaching was at the point, that it was not a symbolic act, that the Eucharist was literally you're eating the body and blood of your God, of Jesus Christ. And incidentally, Catholics and Lutherans, I believe, and a few other Protestant groups do believe that it's a literal transubstantiation into flesh and blood. It's not just wine and bread; it sort of becomes something else. Is that cannibalism? So there are these examples that are cultural and or religious that are kind of blur the boundaries of what exactly cannibalism is. It's not always eating for sustenance. There are other examples of cannibalism that are just kind of bizarre and weird. And in the case of the Sambia, there is an element of patriarchy to it. That's kind of disquieting, but are interesting to think about in many ways. Plenty is not as fun to talk about. I shouldn't say fun, but it's not as interesting to talk about. And in particular, plenty is something, though, that we need to recognize, because even though I'm sure there are students in this class that have faced food insecurity, and perhaps for extended periods of time, we are lucky to grow up in a culture where we do have more options than I think about the kids that spend the abandoned children in India who spend their entire lives in dumps, foraging in the trash and refuse that middle class and upper class peoples throw out, trying to survive. We could have, any of us listening to this lecture right now could have been born in that culture. I think of this when I go to Trader Joe's. Trader Joe's is fascinating. I love Trader Joe's, and I hate Trader Joe's. The foodie in me loves Trader Joe's. There's a lot of interesting stuff in Trader Joe's. There's a lot of cool things that I like. They're a little expensive, so I don't go there very often. But I enjoy, I enjoy these kind of interesting foods and whatnot. Trader Joe's, however, has this whole conceit about being global village and culture, and this kind of spicy marmalade is from the hardworking peoples of the island of Sulawesi. Well, do you think for a second that the people on the island of Sulawesi are eating spicy marmalade? There's a certain world snobbery to a place that has this kind of conceit of we're, buying up these things from all over the world so that we kind of, and they have money, foreign money, sometimes under glass at the register. They have this whole conceit of you're being a world traveler and that you're kind of paying into this positive aspect of globalism. But the image but it's really a bunch of, if you've ever walked around Trader Joe's, it's a lot of rich white people, upper middle class white people, and people that aren't necessarily upper middle class, and not everyone's white, but there's almost a sort of I don't even know how to explain it, but every time I'm there, I'm a little disquieted at my role in the global food chain. Yes, I like to know that these people are that are picking the oranges and the chili peppers to be shipped off to some factory in Jamaica Plains, New York, to make this marmalade. That they're being paid a decent wage, but I'm not really helping them directly, nor am I really learning about their culture or their lives by eating this spicy marmalade. So Trader Joe's is kind of I'm a little schizophrenic about Trader Joe's. The fact that we go out to restaurants all the time. I'm actually teaching a food class. This is the food class. I get my two classes confused because I talk about a lot of the same types of things. One thing that I was talking about recently in my other class was the 1920s, how people started going out more. And that was kind of a convergence of these two streams of these two classes. There are different times in American history, 1920s being one of them, 1980s being the other, and that's what I'm going to talk about right now, where because of labor models and economic models, more was consumed outside the household. 1920s, it was going out, alcohol was illegal during Prohibition, but everyone was still drinking. And most people, some people made their own alcohol, but a lot of people went out, to these clubs and these bars and these pubs, and they could probably get a little bit of food there too. And happy hour was born. 1980s is another. When I was a kid, we essentially didn't go out to eat much at all. We went out to a sit-down restaurant once a month. We went out to a fast food restaurant once a month. Okay? That was it. There have been times where I've been out to eat more than that once in a single day. Maybe not 3 times, but maybe 3 times in 36 hours. And it wasn't just us. We were kind of economically, we were lower middle class when I grew up. No one went out to eat very much. It just wasn't done. There weren't a huge number of restaurants. There were restaurants around. There was choice, but it wasn't remotely like it was today. During the 1980s, you really started to see, much like you saw in the 1920s, you saw the growth of what I call restaurant culture, which is you're really seeing the maturity of the dual income household, where people have more money to spend and less time to prepare and cook food. And so it just becomes easier to go out. We're also seeing the maturity of a very vertical stratified set of options that we're going to talk about one of the later weeks when we talk about different types of restaurant. But it was just, you could eat out more cheaply, more easily, more effectively. A lot of families had two incomes. You really see the growth of restaurant culture, but you're not seeing that incidentally in other cultures. This is really a thing of the United States. Australians don't do this. Europeans don't do this. They don't eat out nearly as much as we do. Now, the interesting thing about this is I think that the coronavirus a lot of restaurants are going to close. I'm not sure they're all going to open. I think most of us are realizing how much money we're saving by eating at home, that it's healthier to eat at home, and that it's not as difficult as we thought it was. Finally, I mentioned food waste at restaurants and supermarkets. Portions are very, very big. They throw food away. They even throw food away they haven't even pulled out of the freezer yet if they didn't predict it correctly. Again, because of the fear of lawsuits. So, the United States is a good example of where food security and food insecurity meet. We have some of the highest levels of food security in places like Trader Joe's of any country in the world. Yet at the same time, all you have to do is, drive around Riverside, go down to Union Station in Los Angeles, and you'll just see huge numbers of homeless people who are having terrible struggles with food insecurity in the midst of all this plenty. That is Plenty and Privation.